Welcome to our monthly Innovation, Knowledge and Inclusive Development Seminar series at the Open University. I am Dinar Kale. I am a professor of innovation and development here at the Open University. We are delighted to have an amazing seminar, and Samuel with us today to present the seminar in the 20th IKD seminar series. Dr. Samuel Rogers is a research fellow at the Open University and works on the ERC funded project Redefine. He's also visiting scholar at the University of Berlin. The title of the seminar is The Political Economy of Hungarian Authoritarian Populism. It's based on the book published in 2024 by Samuel. The book title is The Political Economy of Hungarian Authoritarian Populism, The Capitalist Without the Right Kind of Capital. It's open access book and you can find it on the OU website. The Professor Giles Mohan is also joining us today. He is a professor of international development at the Open University, and he will act as a discussant at the seminar. Giles is currently leading a ERC funded project of reorienting development and the dynamics and the effects of Chinese infrastructure investment in Europe, Redefine. Before starting, some rules. The video is recorded and will be available for playback. So if so people who don't want to be featured can ask the questions in Q&A and ask to remain anonymous. You are automatically muted. Please raise your hands if you want to ask a question during the seminar. After that, there will be a Q&A session. We have a Twitter account or X account, which is intdevelop dev underscore OU. Just to say, the format of the seminar will be Samuel will be presenting his work, followed by Giles presenting some of his comments on the work, and then we will open it to Q&A. So without further ado, I hand over Samuel, and over to you, Samuel. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Dinar. And thank you, Dinar, for the invitation to present my work today. It's going to be an overview of the book, which Dinar mentioned I published a few months ago. And I'd also like to thank Craig and Alison for helping facilitate today's presentation through their organizational skills. I'm going to now share my slides with you. Are they shared? I can never tell if they are. I think so.
Yes, we can see the slides.
Okay, that's great. Thank you very much. So as Dinar mentioned, the title of my talk today is probably a bit predictably the exact same title as my book, The Political Economy of Hungarian Authoritarian Populism, with the subtitle Capitalists Without the Right Kind of Capital. The subtitle is quite important, and I'll mention that in the talk. As was mentioned, I'm currently a postdoctoral research associate at the Open University, and I work on Giles Mohan's Redefine project. And that project has, for the last 3.5 years, been studying Chinese-sourced investment into infrastructure projects across Europe. And there is a connection with the book as well, which predates Redefine, insofar as Hungary is one of the 4 countries that Redefine studies. And indeed, Hungary has been the country which I have been leading over the last few years whilst working on Redefine. So the book came from my PhD studies, and which I did at the University of Bristol, which I concluded just before COVID, which was unfortunate timing for employment terms. But what I wanted to do was look at this particular country, and I would also like to, at this point, say that I'm not a Hungarian person, and I do not have any familial connections with that country. However, since first visiting in 2006, for different periods of time, I've lived there, I've visited, I've conducted work there. So for a non-Hungarian person, it is a country I know relatively well. And it became clear to me over these years of living and working and visiting that this was a country which was undergoing a lot of change, quite visibly. And I wanted to kind of understand why that was. And another thing which is also important, which I'll probably mention again, is that this is a very small country. It's only has a population of only 9.5 million, there or thereabouts. There are sizable minorities, especially in the countries around it, and these are mostly for historical reasons. But it's a very small country, and it's a quarter the size of Poland, for example. However, for its small size, it receives a huge amount of attention in media and scholarship. And of course, I've contributed to that myself. So, try and go to the next slide. Okay, so um, kind of inspiring my work were three broad questions. First one is, how could we understand populism in Hungary? And I put this in brackets because, or in quotation marks, because the word populism, as I discuss in the book, is in crisis. It's too often applied quite loosely to different regimes, left, right, I mean politically left and right, in different geographical parts of the world. And the victim of that is the word itself, insofar as it loses a lot of meaning. And I wanted to address that with respect to contemporary Hungary. A second question, and after all, I am a political economist, was what kind of capitalists can we observe in Hungary? And please, I would like to emphasize the word capitalists and not capitalism here. So agency is a big aspect of this particular project and my broader work in general. And finally, which internal and external capital flows help support the present Hungarian government? And again, because it's such a small country, I found that this final question was a really important question to take on. These are the 6 chapters of the book, probably no big surprises in organizational terms. The first 2 chapters constitute the sort of theoretical aspects of the book, which I'll talk about shortly. So the first chapter really deals with the type of populism as I see it that has been under development in Hungary. And then the second chapter, as I've already mentioned, this is the subtitle of the book, which, as I said, is important. So what I do in this chapter is proceed with conceptualizing and theorizing what I mean by this. Chapters 3, 4, and 5 constitute the empirical aspects of the book, and these are divided into broadly defined the internal and external legs of capital, as I term it. So chapter 3 looks at the recalibration of the domestic political economy in Hungary, whilst chapters 4 and 5 look specifically at two specific infrastructure development projects in the country, which have been in large part financed by loans from quote unquote Eastern countries. And I mean that in a non-pejorative sense. And the 6th chapter offers a discussion and a conclusion on what has come before. This table is lifted from the book directly, and what it does is it contains 4 types of what we could call regime. And I realize that this does have pejorative connotation, but it could be a political system. So I wanted to be quite neutral with this terminology. And these are, as I said, Hungary's received a lot of attention. So these are just 4 of quite a lot of different types of different ways of understanding populism or liberalism in that particular country. But these 4 I found particularly helpful for my own work. And I would like to draw your attention to 2 aspects within this table. The first is the third row down, the third example, I should say. And this is the so-called liberal prebendal type. And this is created by a well-known Hungarian sociologist, Széchenyi Ivan, who borrowed the term prebendal, prebendalism from Max Weber. And this is specifically a form of organization of government, you could say, which differs from others, say, for example, patrimonialism or sultanism, and specifically in prebendalism, the staff are, imbued with goods, or to use a Bavarian word, booty, if you like, with the quid pro quo that they remain politically loyal. And so that is the implicit message there. Perhaps it's explicit, but no one has told me that. So we can run with the implicit parts there. So this was a particularly helpful way for me for thinking about this. And the second aspect I'd like to draw your attention to is the fourth column. And this is the domestic and or international aspects here. And it's only the fourth example here which deals with both of these parts. And this is what those authors call externally constrained hybrid regime. And in this particular article, they look at how Hungary and its hybrid regime is assisted systematically by the European Union. And I found this also particularly helpful for my own work. But it begged the question for me, well, not all of the money is coming from the European Union. And so it's certainly worthwhile thinking about where else money comes from. And that's what I tasked myself with doing in this project. One of the ways to do that I found quite helpful is somebody who formerly worked at the OU. Unfortunately, I never met him, but has been somebody who has been quite inspirational to me, theoretically speaking, and that is Stuart Hall, who himself created and conceptualized and theorized really authoritarian populism. He described it as an exceptional form of the capitalist state, which, unlike classical fascism, has retained most, though not all, of the formal representative institution in place, and which at the same time has been able to construct around itself an active popular consent. Now, I found this particularly helpful for thinking through this problem, the problem being what kind of populism is there in Hungary. And you can see the date here is 1979. And what he was doing, as I'm sure many of you know, was rather presciently describing what he himself termed Thatcherism. And this was the same prescient because this is the year that she was elected to the prime ministership. So I wanted to use Hall's work on authoritarian populism and apply it to the Hungarian case. But as I've already mentioned, as a political economist, I think it's very important to connect authoritarian populism and capital. And this is something that Hall himself did, although he wasn't fully dedicated to this. But when he did, he was also rather prescient, and he wrote that Thatcherites are at the forefront of what they think is the new global expansion of capitalism. Now, this quote is now 38 years old, and we could say with probable confidence that indeed was very prescient. And of course, there have been libraries worth of books and articles and whatever that have attempted to analyze, some more successfully than others, Thatcherism, neoliberalism, what this means, where it happens, etc. So this really kind of underscores the importance of this kind of work, authoritarian populism, and how it's connected to capitalism and capitalists. As I said, I'm quite interested in the agency part. There is a lot of Gramscian jargon associated with Stuart Hall, and I think that this also remains important to understanding contemporary capitalist development. And this particularly gravitates around the conjunctural moment or the conjunctural terrain from how a place where capitalist relations develop. And of course, part of this in Hall's original work was the so-called moral panics and the common sense reactions which oscillate around society and which kind of in essence serve to support that particular mode of capitalist development. So the question was really, is this applicable to Hungary? And of course, we would not be here if I thought in the negative. So I rather lazily threw the adjective Hungarian in front of Hall's terminology and then proceeded to my analysis therein. And I want to say that these three aspects you can see on the screen, these are all interconnected. So what I would like to note that the form of hegemonic politics in the first box here, this it's important to realize that just as Thatcherism predated Thatcher's election to office in 1979, Hungarian authoritarian populism predates 2010, which is the year that Fidesz were elected for a second time, and they are still in power today. So that's 15 years. And for those who may not know, they were first in office between 1998 and 2002. And it was a very ideologically different party then. But when they lost election in 2002, and they only lost that by a very small fraction, they essentially decided that that would never happen again. And it hasn't happened again. So they've been very successful in that. But how did they do that? What they did was, I argued, that they created a kind of form of hegemonic politics. So they went out to the countryside. There's quite a big literature on this. They created civic networks there, and they really hammered home the conservative and traditional values that one might associate with any particular country. Another aspect of Hungarian authoritarian populism is this reconfiguration of domestic capital. And here I build quite a lot on Cellini's work, which I'll discuss again in a moment. And then finally, there's the alteration of the state structures and how this helps to facilitate the inflow of externally sourced capital. Of course. Oh yeah, the other thing I wanted to say was the marrying. Yeah, what I want to say is marrying Hall's work to political economy analysis is something I wanted to do. So in order to do that, I looked at the quite well known now varieties of capitalism tradition. And it's quite jargon heavy. So there are two market economy models within this tradition. One is the dependent market economy model, or the DME. And these are all ideal types, of course, but in the literature, Hungary is one of the four countries which comes close to personifying this ideal type. And a second is this SME, or state permeated market economy model. And China is one of three states which comes close, or market economies, which comes close to resembling this particular ideal type. And given one of the chapters, as I've already mentioned, discusses a particular infrastructure project in Hungary financed in large part by Chinese source capital, it seemed appropriate to me to look at this theoretical tradition and try to understand what happens when when two countries that come close to resembling these ideal types interconnect or interact, and what that means for capitalist development. I've already mentioned the role of agency and the predominance of this kind of a loyalty aspect within the national bourgeoisie. And then finally, another reason I looked at this is because a lot of the comparative capitalism work has kind of busied itself with looking at sort of institutions only. And I've been quite critical of that in my own work. So I wanted to add some sort of politics to this approach. Of course, marrying any theoretical traditions, especially those who would, on the face of it, seem rather disparate, come with tensions and fusions. And I've created just a brief list here. And one of the key tensions is here is this post-structural versus, for want of a better word, institutional approach, and how can we really, fuse those to explain contemporary development. But there are ways of doing this, and I think this can be a rather happy marriage, and these are just a few examples here. And I've just to give you a couple, another criticism I've always had of comparative capitalism is that it tends to focus on so-called advanced economies. So I wanted to move away from that, and the role of political agency, which I think is a really important and understudied aspect. The subtitle of the book, which I've already mentioned, I will now talk about. And I think this is worthy of its own slide. For those of you who've seen me say this before, I'm sorry for boring you, but the image you can see is a screenshot of a book published in 1998 by Verso called Making Capitalism Without Capitalists. And this still remains one of my favorite all-time book covers. You can see what you can see is two women. They look like they're selling fish. It looks very cold, and they have snow on their hats and their bags. We don't quite know where they are. Perhaps they're in Russia or another part of the world which is close to there. And one would imagine that these women were not doing this just a few years previously. So that for me, this image really captures what was happening in the 1990s in what was used to be called the Second World, but now is kind of loosely called post-socialist Europe. So in this particular book, what the authors do is they have this kind of Bourdieuian they invoke the Bourdieuian cultural capital, and to say that in three countries, Hungary, Poland, and Czech Republic, after the change in 1989, suddenly there became leaders in those countries that did not have political capital or economic capital. Rather, they had cultural capital. And what they mean by that is just a few years previously, in the 1980s or 1970s, a lot of these people were artists or playwrights or essayists, etc. Some of them were dissidents, some of them have been in and out of prison. But they did not really know how to, according to the authors, make capitalism, and they weren't really capitalists either. And what I want to argue here is to invert this title into the subtitle Capitalists Without the Right Kind of Capital, because I argue that capitalists have absolutely been made. They're globally embedded, just as capitalism has certainly been made in this part of the world. However, they seem to be quite dissatisfied, and they're always on the lookout for new accumulation pathways. So what kind of pathways are they traveling down, and what kind of capital do they want? I've already mentioned that Fidesz was first in office about 25 years ago. And again, Cellini writes that in the same article I've already discussed. What they did was one of their big failures during this time in office was they failed to co-opt big capital. So they did not develop their own bourgeoisie. They certainly have not made this mistake again. And even before they were re-elected in 2010, it was quite clear that they would win. Had been quite clear for a few years for different reasons, which I won't go into now. But they did not make this same mistake twice. And so what they did was they recalibrated rather heavily the domestic political economy. It wasn't absolutely radical. So German capital still dominates Hungary, but it's much less so now than it was, say, 20 years ago. So there's much more capital back in domestic, which means loyal. There's this agency aspect again, Hungarian hands. So the Hungarian Authoritarian Project is looking for capital in two broad formats, as I've already mentioned. The first is internal, and the second is external. So as I write in the book, in the third chapter, in the internal aspect, this is what I describe as the subsumption of domestic business. And this is where a lot of, I mean, this is a familiar story. This isn't particularly unique to Hungary, but it just means that in essence, the way it's organized now is you have, especially in the infrastructure sector, you have rather large tenders that go out. They go out at inflated prices. They are designated essentially in a very, quite rather undemocratic process to particular people, actors who are, of course, close to the government. And then those projects are subsequently developed. And this is quite a common theme across different sectors of the economy. With regard to the external leg, as I've already mentioned, there are these two infrastructure projects. So the first one is what's called the Paks 2 extension. Paks is a nuclear power plant, and it's the only nuclear power plant in Hungary. And this is also about 10 years old, as is the railway. They're about 10 years old now, a little bit more, maybe 11 years old now. And this is an extension. So the original power plant was built in the early 1980s this is obviously, of course, during the Cold War, and this was developed through Soviet expertise. And as I've already mentioned, I don't just spend uh, my entire time in the book saying that this is all negative and all bad, and this is all bad for Hungary. Far from it. There are absolute advantages to using Russian expertise in this particular infrastructure development. So that's part of it. But of course, the capital involved is extremely high. The loan is approximates about 10 billion euros. So it's a very large loan. And the second example here is this Belgrade to Budapest railway upgrade. And this is also about 11 years old now. The original railway was built in the 19th century, but the idea here is to make it into a high-speed track. It won't be. It will be medium speed. But there are different reasons for that. But the issue here, if I can call it that, is that this was financed by Chinese capital to a rather large extent, although the final details are unknown because they've been codified by the government. So we're not aware of the final costs here, but it is under development. And I can say that the Serbian section, because of course this is cutting across two countries, is complete. And the Hungarian section is due for completion at the end of this year. And ultimately, this is set to connect to Piraeus in Greece, which means the idea is that Chinese goods will be shipped to Piraeus and then will be transloaded onto trains, then delivered to Budapest in the first instance, and then dispersed onward to mostly Western Europe. So these are the avenues of capital accumulation that I look at in the book. Methodologically, I'm much more of a qualitative methodological person rather than quantitative. And I collected data from 45 semi-structured interviews over a 5-year period, as you can see. And this was done across 6 rounds of field work. So there was quite a lot of it. Of course, this period goes over COVID, so there were a couple of years when I couldn't travel there. But nonetheless, I managed to speak to quite a few different people. Unfortunately, I was not able to access anybody from Fidesz. They did not respond positively to my invitation for them to contribute to my work. So I have to admit that there is a slight bias in there. Although at the same time, I wasn't just interviewing opposition politicians and asking them to say very bad things about the government, because that wouldn't have told me or very much, and it wouldn't have been able to inform the research very much. So there are an array of different people I interviewed there, and I was assisted by some local universities, which I've listed there. One of which is no longer in the country as it was ejected. These are some photos I took myself from fieldwork. On the left is the nuclear power plant. This is not the extension. This is from the 1980s. Um, and that's in the center of Hungary, next to the Danube, so about 100 miles or so, 150 kilometers or so south of Budapest. On the right is a signpost written in Hungarian, which announces the Belgrade-Budapest railway upgrade and how it's all proceeding ahead. And this was taken outside a provincial um, railway station in Hungary. These are two photos from a suburban part of Budapest in the south of the city. And this shows the railway under construction. So as I said, an ongoing project, and it is definitely happening. In fact, colleagues and I from Redefine visited this very site about 2.5 years ago now. So I haven't been there for about a year or so, maybe a bit more. So these are perhaps a little bit out of date now. But I wanted to give you a sense of this infrastructure development as it is under construction. And then just to kind of finish off, I wanted to conclude by really underscoring that um, there is the theoretically speaking, there is a sorry interconnectivity between these ideal types in the varieties of capitalism literature. And I think I would like, to see further research. I mean, I might even do this myself on what I term in the concluding section, the China, Germany, Hungary tripartite. And what I mean by this is you have, if we stick to the varieties of capitalism literature jargon, you have a state-permeated market economy model example, China, interacting with a coordinated market economy model example, Germany, accommodated by a dependent market economy uh, model example, Hungary. So, and this is specifically around battery production and electric vehicles. So it's no coincidence that the largest Chinese investment in the region is in Hungary, and it is a battery plant, and this was announced in summer 2022. It's no coincidence that this is located just about 50 kilometers from a Mercedes-Benz factory. So these are in harmony, and so it would be interesting to learn a little bit more about how these things develop over time. I would like to also underscore that the role of agency is really crucial here. I've mentioned this a few times, but I think this is a rather understudied aspect, and it's hard to really tell you everything that happens in the book in this brief presentation, but I try and emphasize that this is understudied, and it would be good to see more work run with that. And then finally, there are, of course, these geopolitical, geoeconomic questions about the so-called new or Second Cold War, and what these kind of interconnections mean. Of course, we now have a new, not new, president in the United States, and what this means. Orban, the Prime Minister of Hungary, has ostensibly very close relations with that particular person. So it's hard to say what this means, but there are some interesting developments that are worthy of study. And I already mentioned that Hungary, for its small size, gets a rather sort of large amount of attention compared with other regional cognates. And I'm a little bit critical of that, but I think also it's for good reason. I mean, Hungary is often quite a first mover in these kind of aspects. So we'll have to see how these things develop. I enjoyed writing the book very much, and I am grateful for your attendance, and I look forward to any questions you might have. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot for that, Samuel. Now I hand over to Giles as a discussant, and then we'll open it for Q&A. Giles, over to you.
Yeah, thanks, Dina. Thanks, Sam and Craig. So yeah, I'm not going to do standard. When we set this up, it wasn't going to be sort of a standard discussion. So I'm probably not going to engage, let's say, directly with Sam's argument, although I'll touch on it in various ways, but more to sort of situate his work with some of this work that he mentioned in terms of our Redefine project and some of the colleagues from the project here today. So I mean, one of the things that the Hungary case does seem to me to highlight is the importance of infrastructure in sort of regime maintenance. So it's about rendering infrastructures are very often about rendering power quite tangible and regulating the relationship between the state and its citizens. So the kind of things that people like Michael Mann and Jim Scott have written about, very eloquently over the past. But I think what's slightly different, and Sam was sort of pushing at this with I think one of the earlier tables. This infrastructure is also about connectivity. So it's and one of the kind of arguments within this sort of second Cold War literature is that the first Cold War was about superpowers trying to create client states and spheres of influence, where the current conjuncture in the global economy between China and the US and others is really about how do you maintain connections, and so the logistics and infrastructure become very important in all of that. So Sam alluded to, the railway that links to Piraeus. We've got colleagues working on those cases that are here today. So I think there's something then about slightly different kind of spatial an economic and political relationship that these infrastructures are about. And I think Sam alluded towards the end as well about, Hungary's in this weird position of being both eastward and westward looking. It's got relations with the US. It brokers between the EU and China and kind of plays one off against the other in quite interesting ways. And infrastructure becomes kind of the focus of all of that, or not the only focus, but a key focus. But I think what's interesting then about this current infrastructure era that we're looking at is the role of international investment. So Michael Mann was writing at a time when states kind of control their borders and the investments that went on within them, and states could then guide that. They obviously still can, but I think what's important now is that a lot of the infrastructure that we're seeing, whether this is obviously British water companies, owned by Australian banks and the rest of it, is that this infrastructure is invested globally, which I think requires a much more relational analysis. And then the bottom tier of Sam's table was about the kind of domestic international interface of the kind of politics we're seeing. So there's a whole literature now on the kind of role of state capitalist actors. So and I don't want to get into the debates about who's state capitalism, what does state capitalism mean, because we could go down a very interesting rabbit hole, but we probably haven't got time. So countries like China, but also Gulf states and others are kind of deemed to be state capitalists, and they're one of the investing very heavily in this overseas infrastructure investment. I think what's also interesting to think about in that context, and we've just finished reading a book as a research team, is Leila Khalili's Sinews of War and Trade, where she looks at the Arabian Peninsula, and you just in one sense, without being flippant, what the colonial, particularly Britain, did in that area around in Yemen and Aden and the rest of it, and has been doing with various sort of cronies in that area, dwarfs what China and any other kind of so-called state capitalist countries are now doing outside of those countries. But I think in terms of trying to understand that relational state capitalism, China's often held up, I think, as somehow exceptional. Depending on your stance, it's an aberration. It's seen as standing in stark contrast to the kind of fairness, if you like, of the liberal international order and liberal economies. So we get very lazy analysis, I think, which assumes because China is increasingly authoritarian, then its investments somehow must pervert the political systems in which it invests. So we've got, as I mentioned, Trump coming in, and he's now saying we're going to take back Panama. China now runs Panama allegedly, and therefore we need to take back China. So I mean, I don't want to get into the kind of discursive analysis of what Trump's really trying to do with all of this, but it's that kind of analysis that we see pervading a lot of diplomatic thinking and some academic thinking about China being exceptional and in some ways kind of venal in many of the things it does, or at the other side of it, it prefers to deal with other authoritarian regimes. So some of the analysis of Eastern Europe, and Hungary, is that, well, Orban's authoritarian, China's authoritarian, it's a match made in heaven. Of course they're going to kind of collaborate. And Sam's work shows very clearly that actually German capital is more dominant within Hungary than Chinese capitalism is, and therefore this idea that somehow China is trying to sort of gain footholds in Eastern Europe is a misnomer. Which you actually look at the data, and even these EV factories that Sam mentioned, they're going to feed the German car industry. They're not, and so this idea that somehow China's pulling Hungary away from the EU and Europe is a misnomer because of these entanglements of different forms of capital. But I think the other side of our work, and colleagues from Redefine might want to chip in at some point, is that a lot of the Chinese firms we're looking at are not that different from other multinational firms. Now, that in itself is an interesting finding. I think people want to find the China difference all the time, and therefore find Chinese firms to be exceptional and doing something, whether that's pejorative as doing something bad or just doing something differently. But that's not to say that some of the Chinese investments in big infrastructure that we're looking at are not intensifying a lack of accountability. They're not and they are maybe increasing inequality, but that, in a sense, which is not a particularly positive conclusion, that's no different from what other investors are doing in similar types of projects. In terms of, in Manchester, we're seeing Qatari money coming in and creating huge housing problems because it's built to rent for a certain class of consumer, and so a lot of these infrastructure projects have uneven distributional outcomes, and so I don't think this, in many senses, China's intervention in some of these areas is not exceptional in many senses. But to kind of avoid, I think, some of the laziness of some of this sort of analysis, and I'm now going to try and share my screen. He said boldly.
Samuel, you might want to, yeah, that's fine. Yeah.
You can see that. Yeah, no.
Yes, yeah, we
Great.
see that. Yeah.
So yeah, so some of the, to avoid some of this laziness, I think we've been trying to think about comparative analysis. So you trying to understand these in relational terms. So when it's Chinese capital in Hungary vis-a-vis German capital, or Chinese capital in Greece vis-a-vis Greek ship owners and the like, and US investment. So rather than sort of, as Sam said, rather than trying to think in terms of exclusive varieties of capitalism, there is something called Chinese capitalism, or capitalism with Chinese characteristics. These firms and the capital they bring are already entangled with other forms of capital, so that you can't really sort of say there's something distinctly Chinese. You have to look at those relationships on the ground, and that's really quite difficult empirically and methodologically, I think. You're looking at multiple actors, you're looking at multi-sited projects, you're looking at projects that straddle different spatial kind of spaces, if you like. And as a geographer, then we've kind of been struggling, how do we then move, if we're not thinking in terms of methodological nationalism, there's something called China that acts in a particular way, and its firms have certain characteristics that make them particularly Chinese, that actually then you're trying to look at other kind of ontologies of framing those relationships, and not, we've talked about corridors, there's beltscapes, there's nodes, there's enclave, there's zones, there's territories. So we're all playing around in this field about, well, if this new infrastructure kind of geopolitics is about connectivity, then thinking in terms of sort of bounded states is really very unhelpful and not always a good starting point. So we're trying to sort of, how do you bring together that domestic and international in the conjuncture of particular projects? So to that end, a couple of things just to finish with as shameless plugs of what you can do if you're really interested in Hungary, which you should be now, even if you weren't before. So tomorrow we have another seminar on our Redefine series. So a colleague from Hungary who comes very well recommended by Sam, and who will be speaking around China's involvement in Hungary, which, as Sam said, has become a kind of quite an explosive and interesting kind of topic in itself. And the Redefine project, we've got another 9 months to go till we run out of cash, but we're organising a conference next month on campus. If you see lots of people wandering around lost at the end of February, it's because they're at our conference, which is really trying to look at, so I can't actually see the PowerPoint now, so has that gone forward or not?
No, I think it's still on first.
Okay.
Yeah, now it's gone. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so what we're doing with the conference is really, there hasn't been, when you're trying to track these kind of multi-sided, complex processes really on the ground, I haven't, most people fixate, and it's a realistic fixation about getting access to Chinese companies. And as Sam said, it's hard to get, in authoritarian context, hard to get hold of political actors. It's very hard to get hold of Chinese actors in these big state-owned enterprises that we're looking at. And that's been the kind of the main discussion around methodology, but there's so much more that's not been talked about, which we want to raise in our conference. Intercultural working, cross-cultural working. How do you, how, as somebody who's an expert of a particular place, how do you then do multi-sited, cross kind of political, cross-economic research? So, yeah, if you're around and want to come, do come along. I'm sure we could do a deal for OU colleagues for that conference. Yeah, but thanks, Sam. I will now shut up
Thanks.
and open up for questions.
Yes, thanks, Giles. Thanks, Sam. And I open it for the question. Just raise your hands, and then we can take the questions. If you have put in the Q&A, I can in the chat. I can pick that up from. So, who wants to go first? Just raise the hand. You will have access to your mics and the cameras as well if you want to. Okay. Yes, Leslie, go ahead.
Thanks very much indeed. Can you all see me and hear me okay?
Yes, we see you
yeah.
well. Yeah.
Right. Okay. Well, see me and hear me, that's the key thing. First of all, Sam, this is a very, very important contribution. Fortunately, we can see the whole of the book on the OU site. I've had a very, very brief run through this morning, and I can testify to your diligence, your research sources, and all of the material that you've read. I suppose the slight criticism that I have is that in the list of interviewees on page 74, there isn't anybody who's either Fidesz or Fidesz oriented. And most of the former ministers or former officials that you interviewed obviously won't be Fidesz. But can I just cut through that and say that while I don't share Fidesz politics, I think we have to fit all of this into a contemporary framework. I mean, for people like me, if I may say so, Hall and Soskis and even Stuart Hall are a bit dated. You're really talking about 1980s stuff. And what we've all been overtaken with is Maastricht, monetary union, and the way the European Union works. And I suppose the main question that I have to put to you, having had a very, very brief read through, is that if you don't do it like this, and if you're a peripheral country like Hungary, and it's the same with the rest of the Visegrad Four, because the others in the Visegrad Four have all got slightly different interpretations of this. But if you don't do stuff like this, and you're a European Union peripheral country, and you're very much dependent on the whim of the European Commission and the Council of Ministers, if you don't do it like this, I'm not quite sure what you do. I mean, the fact is that monetary union under Maastricht very much confines what you can borrow. It very much confines what you can do as a nation state. And this is why we're very soon going to have a combination of Orban, Fico, Babic, Ceausescu, and obviously supported by AFD and other people like that. They will soon be able to have a blocking minority in the Council of Ministers. So, I mean, the whole drift of your book and the whole drift of what you're trying to say is sooner or later going to become the majority drift, particularly from Central and Eastern Europe. I won't go on because you'll cut me off when we've got another session tomorrow. But this is a very, very important contribution. As I say, I don't share Fidesz politics, but if you exist in the European Union, particularly in the European Union as it's today constituted, I'm not quite sure, quite honestly, what else you do. I mean, having been involved in politics for a fair time myself, I mean, a lot of what you describe, quite honestly, is the way that politics works. I mean, a lot of us have spent a hell of a time, for example, going to Brussels saying, this is the kind of programme we want to see. And the reason that we've said that to the Commission in Brussels in various directorates general is these were the kind of projects that we wanted to see funded. So what Orban and what Central and Eastern European countries are doing with European funding, quite honestly, is what we all do.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you very much for this question and your complimentary comments. I really appreciate that. In order to address them, I'm going to first talk about the interview list that you mentioned in the book, page 74, as you said. and the kind of dearth in Fidesz and or Fidesz related people whom I met or at least contributed to the work. Yeah, I did mention this briefly in my talk. I couldn't, it wasn't for want of trying. I really did. I messaged them a lot. I visited their offices in person. I came close a couple of times to meeting a couple of them, but in the last minute they withdrew for whatever reason. So it was challenging. And I would also like to say that, I first went to Hungary in a kind of academic capacity at the end of 2015, so almost a decade ago. And as time has gone on, it's become more and more challenging to get access to these people. And I found the same thing, the book project aside, in Redefine, and Giles mentioned that as well, that access to people who would like to, who are close to the government or in some way, is much more reduced in authoritarian areas. Let's put it that way loosely. So it's very challenging. I'm also not a Fidesz. I don't particularly agree with their politics, at least not wholesale. I cannot vote there as I'm not a Hungarian citizen, but it would have been much more beneficial to the research to include them. But unfortunately, that's one of the, I think, limitations to this particular research project, unfortunately. But, we keep trying to get access and see how far that gets us. How far can these Visegrad countries develop, or CEE countries develop, is a kind of a paraphrase of your own question, but it's an absolutely fair question. And and how kind of how normal is this politics? I'm kind of paraphrasing you, but it's something like that. And I totally agree. I mean, I wrote an article about 3 years ago. It was as part of a special issue on state capitalism, and it focused on Serbia, which is not an EU country. It's not in NATO. It's not in the Eurozone, and it's considerably poorer than a country like Hungary or even Croatia, which only joined the EU a decade or so ago. So it's and the article was talking about how it's kind of there's a lot of noise about how it's attracting Chinese capital, and there's xenophile aspects within the society now because the state-owned media kind of forces people to think in this way and whatever. So the article was about kind of separating these aspects and trying to understand exactly your point, like how can these countries develop, what they're going to do. It's not that Serbia just is it has to be in the Western camp, so-called. I mean, how is it going to do that if it doesn't have access to all these cohesion fund mechanisms and all these kind of things? I mean, just to say something obvious, normal people with regular lives, they're not really bothered either way. What they want is a road system that works, a transport network that's functioning, hospitals that are, reasonable quality, etc. What we would all expect in, contemporary society. So, how they're going to fund and finance these projects is an open question. So they're very limited in their policy choices. When it comes to the EU members, Hungary included, of course, it's also an important question. I mean, how are they going to develop? I mean, as I mentioned a couple of times, Hungary receives so much attention in the media via the other countries like Poland, which is much bigger, or the Czech Republic, or whatever. And part of the story, I think, is that it's very helpful, let's say, to have a kind of, from the EU's perspective, to have a kind of scapegoat, to keep Hungary as a kind of black sheep in the family, to say, oh, well, stuff isn't going very well. Well, it's all Orban's fault. He's vetoing everything all the time. But it works both ways. Orban can say whatever he likes about the EU, whether he's in Budapest or in Brussels. He can say nasty stuff and about how undemocratic it is. But at the end of the day, there's a lot of financial flows that go that way as well. So it's a bit of a complicated story. But I think the point you raise about the blocking minority, that is interesting, because we're going to see how far there are alliances within around this, not just Hungary, but around the kind of the idea that how can we develop? How can we, advance our political economies or societies? And when you mix this with the flavor of I don't know, traditionalist conservative politics, let's call it, which includes the IFD, as you mentioned. I mean, Germany was 1/3 of it has a socialist history at least, so there is a crossover there as well from socio-historical lines. What this means going forward is an open topic, and just while we're on it, a research agenda I'm trying to develop at the moment is what I would call broadly the political economy of illiberalism, because we need to really better understand how these countries develop, what it means, not just for the central government and politics of the day, but across society, and how they, what are the disparities between regions, for example, but also, as you said, what any kind of blocking minority might mean for the EU. I don't want to go on too long, but it's a really good point that you make, and I hope I did an okay job in answering your question. Thank you.
Can I just say one more tiny thing?
Yeah, go ahead.
Very, very briefly. It's not just the blocking minority, it's the fact that if you have a look at the composition of the European Parliament, the combination of the Patriots for Europe group and the Europe of Sovereign Nations group at the moment have got 109 out of 720 members. Now, because they don't have by-elections and because there will be deaths and all sorts of things, that block will soon increase to something like 20% or 25% of the European Parliament. So, coupled with the fact that you only need 4 member states to form a blocking minority, plus that increasing vote in the European Parliament, if I may say so, what Orban is trying to say, in various other ways echoed by other people, is very soon not going to be a majority, but it's going to be a very substantial minority.
Mm. Absolutely. And I would also like to add that, we should think about this issue not in a kind of false, as I say it, false east-west binary, insofar that there's a good west versus a benign east, or whatever. Sorry, benign west versus a malign east. Because, you have a country like Italy, which has an overtly fascist prime minister. In France, let us not forget that the last 2 presidential elections, an overt fascist came second. Their next election is due in 2 years. So, and you already mentioned Germany. So, yeah, we'll have to see what happens. But it's a really important point, and I think it's when I say that Hungary receives a high level of attention, I don't necessarily mean that in a negative way. There are reasons why it receives it, and it seems to be, as I said, quite a first mover. It's a sort of avant-garde in a lot of this in this political and capitalist development in Europe and beyond.
Thanks, Leslie. Thanks, Samuel. Anyone else has a question or wants to raise the hands? It's just fascinating, Samuel. You mentioned about, I'll just, the influence of the country which has over the, you remember, I mean, you must be following it, that whole urbanization of republics and Trump. I have a question whether a diverse country such as US, whether the model which Fidesz has about the hegemony of politics, the reconfiguration of domestic capital alter state, whether that sort of a model, the way they have created this over long period of, and that's sort of a template where other countries want to, whether the diversity of the place, the history, different history, whether that sort of a model can exist and can act as a template for other countries. I mean, again, I'm not the student of politics or even that, but it's just fascinating because there seems to be something similar. I come from India, where the one government is in power for almost 12 years now, and they have something similarities with that. So it's quite interesting that. Also, the one thing which Giles mentioned also struck me about the Chinese multinationals are being different, but or like sorry, or being similar as the other multinationals. Sorry, Chinese firms similar as the other multinationals. But if it is interesting to see what she did to the all those big software IT companies in China, like Alibaba and others, where he put them in place. Whereas yesterday in the Trump, they were on all the big guys were on the dais, and we don't know who controls whom. So they have these different dimensions to this nature of the firm. So
Mm.
how that affects how they work and what sort of influence they have, or what are in terms of outcome as well as the influencing the local politics and the infrastructure development.
Thank you. Yeah, how far is this kind of Fidesz regime, or as I call it, Hungarian authoritarian populism? How far is it, a template for other states, and especially so-called advanced countries like the US, as you mentioned? Hard to say, of course. I think studying any sort of political development depends on quite a deep understanding of its social history and how that country has developed over time. And of course, each country is unique, and Hungary is no different there. So even over the last, let's say, 115 years, now we're in the 2020s. I mean, it was in an empire. It lost two world wars. It was a socialist country for almost half a century, and now and then for 20 years it was completely dominated by German capital. So to sort of echo what Leslie mentioned earlier, in the late 2000s, around the time of the financial crisis, Hungarians were asking themselves, well, what kind of country do we want to be? Do we want to be a conveyor belt for medium quality German goods? I mean, not really. No, that's no way to kind of develop your economy. And this was exactly the kind of disenchantment that Fidesz were absolutely successful in exploiting. And I don't mean that in a negative way. They're skilled politicians. They saw how people felt about this, and they realized, well, no, we don't want this. Again, whether you agree with the trajectory is a different question, but that was where their part of their political success lay. I've already mentioned this about 5 times, but Hungary gets a lot of attention, but so does Orban himself, and he's regularly, excuse me, invited to particular talks. He's become a kind of buddy of Trump's now. He's also a kind of, he's a particular group of Tories, mostly backbenchers, I think, have become sort of mates with him. This extends to French politics, Italian politics, German politics. So these are all quote unquote advanced countries, right? So they do see him as a kind of poster child. I don't think they're naive enough to think that they can simply lift what he's done in Hungary and apply it to their own polities with any degree of success. I think they would end up kind of cherry picking their successes out of it. But even Orban and the Fidesz regime has borrowed from others as well. It's not highly unique. Of course, owning all the media, for example, that helps a lot in helping your population agree with you, if I can put it that way. But we'll have to see what happens. I think in general, there is a broad arc of, a kind of alliance between this traditional conservative, with, politics, especially with, religious undertones, whichever, depending on your part of the world you might be from. And that's interconnectivity with, coming out of the 1980s, heavily deregulated markets, but with a new twist, of course, because of the high level of technological advancement we have these days compared to 40 years ago or so. So there is certainly an alliance there, which is which in part inspires me to proceed with this topic on the political economy of liberalism, as I call it, and to really see how that proceeds. And there is indeed an institute at George Washington University called the Liberal Studies Program, which I would encourage all audience members to have a look at if you don't know it already. And they're doing some excellent work there on answering exactly these kind of questions. So so hard to say. I'm sorry, I'm afraid I forgot your second question.
It was about Chinese firms similar as other multinationals, where you can clearly see that there is a lot more influence of the state and how it,
Okay.
so in that, so I, whether it's really that straightforward way of, is it that straightforward that they are as other profit-seeking multinational firms, or they have
Yeah.
bigger agenda than
I mean, it's a really good question, and there's lots of people out there who are working on this who are much more qualified than I to talk about it. This isn't particularly so close to my work, but I think, as Giles mentioned already, the kind of shadow question to this is really how Chinese is this? How Chinese are these Chinese firms, or in other words, how unique are they, or do they separate? Are they separate from multinationals and things like that? So it is an open question, but as part of Redefine, we've been kind of grappling with that. And Giles mentioned this already, different literatures we've read and different case studies colleagues of mine have worked on, particularly around port infrastructure and the Chinese shipping conglomerate COSCO, which is an enormous company and has an almost unnumberable amount of subsidiaries attached to it. But it has an enormous revenue levels, so it's very hard. Again, this ties back in with Leslie's question. If even if you have what ostensibly would be a very rich port, say Hamburg, for example, how are they really going to develop, and how are they going to compete with ports like Rotterdam or Antwerp or whatever, if they ring up Berlin, and bearing in mind that's a federalized system, and they ask for 5 billion euro to dredge their river or dredge their port because this is very expensive, and Berlin simply says no. And so, how are they going to compete with it? Because there's private interests there, and employment interests there as well. So it's a very complicated story, and this is something I think that we've been trying to think through across the life cycle of Redefine and hopefully beyond. So sorry, this isn't a very profound answer to your question, but it's an open question really, and something that in Redefine we're trying to think through.
Yeah, no, I agree. Thanks. I agree with. I also think. I guess the point is not to assume that because the state, Chinese state, is directing it. So, for example, if you think about the other case that Sam alluded to, we were studying, is say looking at Costco's investment in Piraeus. Now, this is held up as a kind of classic. Oh, China's just trying to open up the eastern part of the Mediterranean and get into Europe, and blah blah blah. But it's way more complicated in terms of those and there's an assumption, certainly very much more hawkish analysis, that this is all it's all part of the Chinese Navy's plans to sort of create offshore bases for military, and it's just like, well, there's no evidence of that. What? And then people go, well, Costco, look, they're Chinese, they screw the labor over there, and the unions are getting upset, saying this is all, look how Chinese people run firms. And actually, you look at the global logistics, how that's evolved over the last 30-40 years since kind of neoliberalism and since 9/11. Whether it's a Chinese company or a Canadian company or a Danish company, that's the way port management's been going. It's been casualized, it's been increased surveillance. So what is particularly Chinese then about that? There may well be, but you can't assume and then just lazily say, well, it's Chinese. There, and as we said, there's the entanglements with domestic capital, with other forms of foreign capital. Sam's been looking at Huawei. That's been the boogie person for in the UK and Germany and the States. A lot of pressure from America back in under Trump 1, I think that was, get Huawei out of your 5G systems. If you look at Hungary, they're already massively, and Vodafone are buying shit off, Huawei to build so these are quote unquote Western European countries that are reliant on Chinese technology and have been for a long time and still will be. And yet, we focus on the Chinese firm as being the bad guys and therefore clearly having, sorry, I'll stop here. But I mean, the other one is that, because of China's kind of approach to human rights, that all these tech companies are there to surveil their populations. What the hell does Google and Apple and the rest of these buggers do? They're surveilling every fart we do, basically. So somehow the Chinese, when they do it, that's venal because they're a state, they're a kind of communist state. When X and Zuckerberg does it, that's somehow, market information. I mean, so I think we've got to I'm not denying what you're saying. I think just have to be careful about how we unpick it more empirically, really.
Yeah. No, I see the point. It just was fascinating to see what she did with the Alibaba and
Yeah.
others, and what
And
yesterday.
I
Yeah,
think there's different sectors and different technologies that vary as well.
yeah,
So I think there's different. I think when people think about interdependence and de-risking and what the risks are, you can't just say that the textile sector's the same as chip
yeah,
manufacture or whatever. So I think again, the other thing we're trying to prod at is how do you pull sectors and technologies apart to look at where the risks may lie or what the kind of implications are, because I think just saying China equals risk is really not particularly helpful.
good. Yeah. Anyone else has any question? This I'll just see. Not, we can bring it to the close. Thanks a lot, Samuel. Thanks a lot, Giles.
Can I
Very
just
fascinating.
can I
Yeah,
just
go
say
on, Leslie.
one more
Yeah,
tiny
yeah,
thing? I mean,
yeah, go
first
on.
of all, if I may say so, Sam, without sounding patronizing, this is a very significant contribution, very significant contribution. And what Giles has just said is equally significant. We really are standing on the edge of the precipice. And some of us quite honestly wonder whether the EU as an organization, as a structure, can survive as it is. What the European Union at the moment is trying to do is Ukraine. It'll be forced to do some of Draghi to compete with the Chinese and the Americans. So defense, Draghi, cohesion fund, and all the bits and pieces. Even all of that would be difficult to do if you'd got a German economy that was doing very well, or if you'd got a French economy that was doing very well. But you've actually got a German industrial economy which has got some very severe problems, particularly in the car industry. France is magnificently overborrowed. Italy hasn't had any real growth in the economy for the past 10 years. So the European Union is trying to do all of this on a very, very insecure base. If I can just say a personal thing, we had a session in Brussels just before Christmas where the new Director General of the new Directorate General on Defence appeared. And I said to him, look, you're trying to do cohesion fund, you're trying to do Ukraine, you're trying to do Draghi and all of the other bits and pieces. How are you going to do defence? And he admitted to me, well, the only way that we're going to do it, quite honestly, is by borrowing from other funds. So the European Union is vastly overstretched. Individual member states in the European Union are very restricted in what they can do. I have to say, I'm not quite sure whether the European Union can hold.
That's a good point, and at least not in its present format. So, how far will it be there all in name, basically, and just be completely hollowed out, to borrow another term. It also has, I mean, Giles also mentioned that, Gulf capital, and its inflow into Europe. And this is also quite understudied, I think, because China, I mean, it's important, obviously, to study China and Chinese development and Chinese capital outflow, etc. But in a sense, it's almost overstudied. It receives a lot of privileging in analytical attention, whereas and at the same time, you have all this Gulf inflow, and usually they grab a lot of very positive headlines. It's all about football clubs, or they're buying huge kind of brownfield sites, and they're going to make them amazing with all these incredible shopping centers and what have you. So there are some, these are also very understudied aspects as well. I mean, speaking as a Londoner, there's so many parts of London that are owned by Gulf capital. These are, I'd like to see some statistics on that. And that's before we talk about, I don't know, Indian capital, for example, or Brazilian capital, for example, or perhaps other parts of the world as well, Turkish capital. So, these are, how far these are methodologically nationalist issues is an important question too. But I suppose I'm kind of implying that I'm a little bit critical of the so-called New Cold War literature, because I think there's a lot more going on than that. So where these players, for want of a better term, operate within this matrix of development is interesting. But but of course, what this means for the EU is I think a really huge question, and not to mention the next 4 years of US politics that we have in store. Thank you.
On that optimistic note,
Sorry.
no. It's important observation, and it's a really fascinating seminar and a discussion. Thanks, Giles. Thanks, Samuel. Thanks, Leslie, for participating and giving your input. Really useful. This will be online hopefully soon, so all of you can go and access it again. And appreciate the discussion and the observation. Have a good day.
Come tomorrow.
Yeah, come tomorrow.
Yeah,
Thank you
I'll
very
be the
much. See you
discussant.
tomorrow. See you tomorrow. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you
Bye.
once
Bye.
again. Take care and bye-bye.